Hey YouTube. I'm gonna get back into the view of the Hebrews. Starting on page 35, last paragraph, or the second from last paragraph. And excuse my background noise. It is what it is. But now they are so abundant to your enemies as to suffice for themselves and their cattle. This wonder you also formerly experienced when the king of Babylon laid siege to your city. The priests of the temple, after the destruction of their sacred edifice, betook themselves, those who had thus far escaped the general slaughter, to the top of one of its broken walls, where they sat mourning and famishing. On the fifth day, necessity compelled them to descend and humbly to ask pardon of the Roman general. But Titus, at this late period, rejected their petition, saying, as the temple, for the sake of which I would have spared you, is destroyed, it is but fit the priest should perish also. All were put to death. The obstinate leaders of the great Jewish faction, beholding now the desperateness of their cause, desired a conference with Titus. One would imagine that they would be at least now. One would imagine they would at least now lay down their arms. The desiring hold on. Their desiring an interview with the triumphant Roman general appeared as though they would be glad to do this, but righteous heaven designed their still greater destruction. Titus, after all their mad rebellions, kindly offered to spare the residue of the Jews if they would now submit. But strange to relate, they refused to comply. The noble general then, as must have been expected, was highly exasperated and issued his general order that he would grant no further pardon to the insurgents. His legions now were ordered to ravage and destroy. With the light of the next morning arose the tremendous flame of the castle of Antonio, the council chamber, registrar's office, and the noble palace of the queen Helena. These magnificent piles were reduced to ashes. The furious legions, executioners of divine vengeance, Ezekiel 9, 5, and 6, then flew through the Lord's city, of which they soon became masters, slaughtering and burning in every street. The Jews themselves aided the slaughter in the royal palace, containing vast treasures. 8,400 Jews were murdered by their seditious brethren. Great numbers of deserters from the furious leaders of faction flocked to the Romans, but it was too late. The general order was given, all should be slain. Such therefore fell. The Roman soldiers, however, being at length weary with butchery, and more than satisfied with blood, for a short time sheathed their swords and betook themselves to plunder. They collected multitudes of Jews, husbands, wives, children, and servants, formed a market and set them up at vendue for slaves. They sold them for any trifle, while purchasers were but few. Their lawgiver Moses had forewarned them of this. Deuteronomy 28:68. And ye shall be sold for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Tremendous indeed must the lot of those be who reject the Messiah and are found fighting against the Son of God. Often had these Jews heard, read, but little it seems did they understand the sense of the tremendous passage. Relative to the Jewish rejectors of Christ, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon my holy hill of Zion. Thou shalt break with them, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt dash them into pieces like a potter's vessel. Thus saith the Lord, say a sword. A sword is sharpened and also furbished. It is sharpened to make a sore slaughter. It is furbished that it may glitter, said God by the prophet Ezekiel 21, alluding to this very event. The sword is sharpened and it is furbished to give it into the hand of the slayer. Cry and howl, son of man, smite upon thy thigh, smite thy hands together, and let the sword be doubled a third time, the sword of the slain. I have set the point of the sword against all their gates, that their hearts may faint and their ruins be multiplied. Ah, it is made bright, it is wrapped up for the slaughter, such and much. More were the divine denunciations of this very scene, which the infidel Jews would not escape, but would incur, and even a merciful God shrunk not from execution. Let the anti-Christian powers, yea, let all infidels and gospel despisers consider this and tremble. The whole Lord's city, now in the possession of the Roman legions, after the respite noted, was set on fire. But the insolence of the devoted Jews in a part of the higher city remained unabated. They even insulted and exasperated their enemies, as though afraid the work of vengeance might not be sufficiently executed. The Romans brought their engines to operate upon the walls of this higher branch of the city, still standing, which soon gave way before them. Before their demolition, Titus reconnoitred the city and its fortifications, and expressed his astonishment that it should ever fall before his army. He exclaimed, had not God himself aided our operations and driven the Jews from their fortresses, it would have been absolutely impossible to have taken them. For what could men and the force of engines have done against such towers as these? Yes, unless their rock had sold them for their iniquities, no enemy could have prevailed against Jerusalem. Josephus, who was an eyewitness of all the scene, says all the calamities which ever befell any nation since the beginning of the world were inferior to the miseries of the Jews at this awful period. The upper city fell before the victorious arms of the Roman conquerors. Titus would have spared all who had not been forward in resisting the Romans, and gave his orders accordingly. But his soldiers, callous to all the feelings of humanity, slaughtered the aged and sick as well as the mass of the people. The tall and most beautiful young men, however, were spared by Titus to grace his triumph at Rome. On the rest, many above the age of 17 were sent in chains to Egypt to be disposed as slaves. Some were reserved to be sacrificed on their amphitheaters as gladiators to be slain in sham fights for the sport of their conquerors. Others were distributed through the empire. All who survived under the age of 17 were exposed for sale. The triumphant general commanded what remained of the city to be razed to its foundation, except 3 of the massed stately towers, Mariam, Hippocos, and facial. These should stand as monuments of the magnificence of the place and of his victory. A small part of the wall of the city at the west also he commanded should be spared, as a rampart for his garrison. The other parts of the city he wished to have so effectually erased as never to be recognized to have been inhabited. The Talmud and the Maimonides relate that the foundations of the temple were so removed that the site of it was plowed by Terentius Rufus. Thus our Savior predicted that there should be left one stone upon another. One awful occurrence is noted as transpiring during the scenes that 11,000 Jews under the guard of one Fronto, a Roman general, were, owing to their own obstinacy and to the scarcity of provisions, literally starved to death. Josephus informs that the 1,100,000 Jews perished in this siege of Jerusalem, that 237,000 perished in that last war and other sieges and battles, besides multitudes who perished by famine and pestilence, making a total of at least 1,400,000. Some hundreds of thousands, in sullen despair, laid violent hands on themselves. About 97,000 were captured and dispersed. Relative to the two great leaders of the Jewish factions, Simon and John, they were led to Rome to grace the triumph of Titus, after which Simon was scourged and executed as a malefactor, and John was committed for life to dungeon. Thus ended their violent contentions. The Roman army, before they left Jerusalem, not only demolished the buildings there, but even dug up their foundations. How fatal was the divine judgment on this devoted city! 5 months before, it was the wonder of the world, and contained at the commencement of the siege more than 1.5 million Jews, native and visitors. Now it lay in total ruins, with not one stone upon another, as Christ had denounced. These ruins, Eusebius informs us he beheld, and Eliezer is introduced by Josephus as exclaiming,
What's up?
What's up?
What are you doing?
Alright, mommy working. Where is our great city, which it was believed God inhabited? The prophet Micah had predicted, therefore shall Zion for your sakes be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the Lord's house as the high places of the forest. A captain of the army of Titus did in fact plow where some part of the foundation of the temple stood, as the Talmud records, and thus fulfilled this prediction. Jesus Christ had foretold of this destruction, that there should be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world. And of the event of Josephus says, if the misfortunes of all nations from the beginning of the world were compared with those which befell the Jews, they would appear far less. No other city ever suffered such things, as no other generation from the beginning of the world was ever more fruitful in wickedness. And we're going to stop right there. We just completed the first paragraph on page 41. We'll pick up. I'm going to go ahead and read in some of the Bill Cooper book, so I might pick back up on this either later on tonight or the next Sabbath or next time I have time. Anyway, I hope everyone is doing well on this Sabbath. The sun is setting. It is 6:47 p.m. And peace and power to each and every one of you and your families. And I'm done.